For 27 years, my cousin was the family's golden boy, the undisputed war hero who cast a shadow over my own military service. I bit my tongue every time he called me a glorified secretary. But lies have an expiration date, and his expired spectacularly in the middle of dinner. In every family, there is an established hierarchy, a quiet understanding of who holds the pride of place. In the Jenkins family, that place belonged exclusively to my cousin, Bradley. From the time we were kids, Bradley was the golden boy. He was the high school quarterback who blew out his knee, the charismatic charmer who always knew exactly what to say to make Aunt Brenda and Uncle Robert beam with pride. I, on the other hand, was Sarah. Just quiet, dependable, straight-A Sarah. When I commissioned into the United States Army as a second lieutenant through my university's ROTC program, my parents were thrilled, but the extended family treated it like a cute extracurricular activity. Aunt Brenda actually patted my shoulder at my commissioning ceremony and said, "That's nice, honey. The military needs good organizers. It'll be great administrative experience for when you want to get a real corporate job." I didn't have the heart or the security clearance to tell her I was going into military intelligence. 2 years later, Bradley announced he was enlisting. You would have thought he was single-handedly storming Normandy. The family threw a massive block party. Uncle Robert bought him a custom-engraved hunting knife to take overseas. Bradley soaked up the attention, talking loudly about how he was going out for the most elite units, how he wanted to be the tip of the spear. He shipped out to basic training, and for the next few years, the family group chat was a non-stop feed of Bradley updates. According to Aunt Brenda, Bradley was deployed on highly classified missions. He was a door kicker, a sniper, a special operator. His stories changed depending on the holiday, but the core theme was always the same. Bradley was saving the world, and I was just sitting at a desk. The truth about my own career was vastly different and incredibly isolating. By the time I made captain, I had deployed 3 times. I had spent sleepless weeks in windowless skiffs, sensitive compartmented information facilities in Bagram and Erbil, analyzing signals intelligence. The intercepts I decoded had stopped ambushes, dismantled IED networks, and brought our actual operators home alive. I carried the weight of the lives we couldn't save, the faces of targets I had tracked for months, and the crushing pressure of zero-fail missions. But because of the classified nature of my work, I couldn't say a word. To my family, I was just Captain Sarah, who works in an office somewhere. The breaking point began at my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary. The entire extended family had rented a massive, rustic lodge in the mountains of Colorado for a week-long celebration. I had to pull war with my commanding officer, Colonel Richard Mitchell, just to get 4 days of leave. I arrived at the lodge exhausted, having just come off a grueling 14-month deployment to a location I couldn't legally name. I drove up in my rental car, wearing a simple pair of jeans and a sweater, desperate for a quiet weekend with my family. When I walked through the heavy wooden double doors of the lodge, the first thing I heard was Bradley's booming laugh. "So there we were," Bradley was saying, holding court by the massive stone fireplace. 0 dark 30, entirely surrounded, and my commanding officer looks at me and says, "Brad, we need a miracle." I just racked the bolt of my M4 and said, "Sir, I am the miracle." I paused in the entryway, my duffel bag hanging off my shoulder. Several aunts, uncles, and younger cousins were sitting around him, wide-eyed and hanging onto his every word. Bradley was leaning against the mantel, holding a tumbler of whiskey. He was wearing a tactical fleece jacket adorned with an assortment of Velcro morale patches, none of which made any cohesive military sense. "Sarah!" my dad called out, spotting me by the door. He hurried over and pulled me into a tight hug. "You made it, kiddo." "Hey, Dad. Wouldn't miss it." The commotion drew the attention of the fireplace crowd. Aunt Brenda turned, giving me a tight, polite smile. "Oh, Sarah, you're here. We were just listening to Bradley's stories from his last tour in Afghanistan. It's just terrifying what our real soldiers go through out there." The emphasis on the word real wasn't accidental. It was a subtle, well-practiced dig. Bradley raised his whiskey glass toward me, an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. "Hey, little cousin, glad you could take a break from the supply closet to join us." I forced a smile, dropping my bag. Good to see you too, Brad. Didn't realize they let Tier 1 operators take leave. We go where we're needed, Sarah, he said, puffing out his chest. You know how it is. Or, well, I guess you don't. How's the paperwork coming along? You guys run out of toner yet? A few of the younger cousins chuckled. My dad bristled, stepping forward to defend me, but I put a hand on his arm and shook my head. Over the years, I had learned it was useless to argue with Bradley. Confronting him only made me look jealous in the eyes of the family. I manage, McCoy said evenly. I picked up my bag and headed toward the stairs. I'm going to go unpack. As I walked away, I heard Uncle Robert say, Don't be too hard on her, Brad. Every army needs a good secretary to keep the files in order, while the men do the heavy lifting. I gripped the strap of my duffel bag so tightly my knuckles turned white, silently counting the stairs as I climbed. Just 3 days, I told myself. Bite your tongue for 3 days, smile for Grandma and Grandpa, and go back to your real life. But I didn't know that my real life was about to walk right through the front door. The next evening was the main event, the official anniversary dinner. The long dining table in the lodge was elegantly set with fine china and candles. Granddad and Grandma were seated at the head of the table, looking incredibly happy. Naturally, Bradley had positioned himself right in the center of the table, ensuring he had the maximum audience. He had dressed for the occasion in his Class A uniform. As soon as he sat down, my trained eyes immediately scanned the fabric. Something was deeply wrong. He was wearing a Combat Infantryman badge, CIB, which made sense for his stories. But right beneath it, he had an air assault badge that was pinned on completely crooked. His ribbon rack was an absolute mess. He had a Silver Star, one of the military's highest awards for valor, but it was placed below an Army Commendation Medal. It was the equivalent of wearing a tuxedo with clown shoes. Anyone who had spent more than a week in the military would instantly recognize that the uniform had been assembled by someone who didn't understand the regulations, or worse, bought the medals online. I sat a few seats down from him, nursing a glass of red wine, my jaw tight. So Brad, Uncle Robert prompted, cutting into his steak. Tell everyone about that mission in Fallujah you were mentioning earlier, the one where you earned that medal. He pointed his fork vaguely at the fake Silver Star on Bradley's chest. Bradley sighed, a perfectly calculated sound of false modesty. I don't know, Dad. You know I don't like to brag. The guys I served with, we don't do it for the medals. Oh, please, Bradley, Aunt Brenda cooed. Your grandparents want to hear it. It's important to share your heroism. Well, Bradley started, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the table. It was back in 2018. We were doing a joint op with SEAL Team 6. I nearly choked on my wine. 2018? Fallujah? SEAL Team 6? The timeline was completely fractured, the location made no sense for that year, and the Army doesn't just casually toss random infantrymen into Tier 1 Navy SEAL operations. We were pinned down in this urban sector, Bradley continued, his voice dropping an octave to sound gritty, taking heavy fire from a fortified bunker. My platoon sergeant went down. The SEAL commander looked at me and yelled, Collins, we need covering fire. But I knew covering fire wasn't enough, so I grabbed a bandolier of grenades, breached the perimeter, and cleared the bunker myself. Carried my sergeant out over my shoulder while taking grazing fire to my Kevlar. The table was completely silent, captivated by this action movie script he was feeding them. That's incredible, Grandma whispered, clutching her napkin. It was just my duty, Grandma, Bradley said solemnly. I couldn't take it anymore. The wine had loosened my tongue just enough to override my professional restraint. Hey, Brad, I said, my voice carrying clearly down the table. Quick question. You said this was 2018 in Fallujah? Bradley blinked, annoyed at the interruption. Yeah, classified sector. Interesting, I said, taking a slow sip of my wine. Because the major urban combat operations in Fallujah ended around 2004, with a brief resurgence in 2014. By 2018, U.S. forces were mostly advising and assisting in entirely different regions. Also, the Army doesn't use the term platoon sergeant in joint Tier 1 operations like that. Furthermore, the silver star on your chest is pinned below your ARCOM, which is in direct violation of AR 670 to 1 uniform regulations. The silence that fell over the dining room was deafening. Every head snapped toward me. Bradley's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. He quickly recovered, puffing up his chest. Listen, Captain, I wouldn't expect a desk jockey who pushes papers all day to understand classified operational details. Just because your little files don't show the real war doesn't mean it didn't happen, and my medals got rearranged in my garment bag. I didn't have time to fix them. Sarah, really? Aunt Brenda snapped, glaring at me with raw hostility. Is that necessary? Are you so jealous of your cousin's bravery that you have to nitpick his uniform at your grandparents' anniversary? I'm not jealous, Aunt Brenda, I said quietly, feeling my dad's hand gently squeeze my knee under the table to calm me down. I just don't like seeing stolen valor in my own family. Stolen valor? Uncle Robert slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silverware. You have some nerve, young lady. Bradley bled for this country, while you sat in an air-conditioned office, typing emails. Robert, please, calm down, my dad interjected, trying to keep the peace. No, David, your daughter is completely out of line, Uncle Robert fired back. She's been bitter since Bradley enlisted. She can't stand that he's a real hero. I opened my mouth to reply, the anger burning hot in my chest, when 3 sharp knocks echoed from the heavy front doors of the lodge. Everyone froze. We were miles up a private mountain road. We weren't expecting any late guests. My dad stood up, throwing his napkin on his chair. I'll get it. The dining room remained in a tense, suffocating silence as my dad walked to the foyer and pulled the door open. Can I help you? I heard my dad ask. Good evening, sir. I apologize for the intrusion, a deep, commanding voice replied. My blood ran cold. I knew that voice. Heavy boots echoed on the hardwood floor as a man walked into the light of the dining room. He was tall, impeccably dressed in his Army service uniform, the silver eagles of a full-bird colonel gleaming on his shoulders. The ribbons on his chest were perfectly arranged, telling the real, silent story of 3 decades of actual combat leadership. It was my commanding officer, Colonel Richard Mitchell. He held a locked, black leather folio under his left arm. He scanned the room, his piercing gray eyes taking in the confused faces of my family, before locking onto me. Captain Jenkins, Colonel Mitchell said, his voice carrying the effortless authority of a man who commanded thousands. I immediately pushed my chair back and snapped to the position of attention. Sir, the entire family stared in absolute shock. They had never seen me in a military context. They had only ever seen quiet Sarah. Seeing me lock into a rigid, disciplined stance of respect completely shifted the gravity in the room. At ease, Sarah, Colonel Mitchell said softly. I relaxed my stance slightly, my mind racing. Colonel, what are you doing here? Is everything all right at the unit? Everything is fine, but I was reviewing the docket, and I realized a rather significant oversight, Mitchell said, stepping fully into the dining room. He glanced around at the family. I hope you all don't mind the interruption, but I have some unfinished business with the captain. Aunt Brenda, clearly confused but always eager to impress authority, put on a sickly sweet smile. Oh, not at all, Colonel. We were just celebrating. My son here, Bradley, is one of your boys. He's a decorated ranger. Colonel Mitchell slowly turned his gaze to Bradley. Mitchell had spent his entire life leading elite infantry. He knew what a warrior looked like. He looked at Bradley's uniform, his eyes lingering on the crooked air assault badge, the impossible ribbon rack, and the fake silver star. Mitchell's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Is that so? Colonel Mitchell said, his voice deathly quiet. Bradley swallowed hard, visibly sweating. The arrogant swagger he had held all evening vanished instantly in the presence of a real apex predator. Yes, sir. Well, former sir. Mitchell took one step closer to Bradley. What was your unit, son? 3rd Battalion, sir. 75th Ranger Regiment. Bradley's voice trembled. Colonel Mitchell tilted his head. Interesting. I commanded 3rd Ranger Battalion in 2012. Who was your company commander? The silence that followed was agonizing. Bradley opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked at his mom, then at his dad, completely trapped. I can't recall, sir. Brain injury. From the IEDs. Colonel Mitchell stared at him for a long, punishing moment before letting out a sharp, dismissive exhale. He turned his back on Bradley, dismissing him completely, and faced me. "Captain Jenkins," Mitchell said, opening the black leather folio. "The Pentagon finally unsealed the after-action report for Operation Silent Dawn in Syria last year. The operation you led the intelligence fusion cell for." My heart stopped. The family gasped. "Syria?" Uncle Robert muttered, looking at me in disbelief. "What is he talking about?" Colonel Mitchell ignored him, his eyes locked on me. "Because of the classified nature of your assignment, we couldn't properly recognize you stateside. But the Director of National Intelligence personally declassified this specific citation this morning. And since you were on leave and I was driving up to Denver anyway, I wasn't going to let another day go by without giving you what you earned." Colonel Mitchell reached into the folio and pulled out a small, velvet presentation box. "For exceptionally meritorious service and unparalleled tactical brilliance," Mitchell read aloud, his voice echoing in the silent lodge. "Captain Sarah Jenkins' Signal intelligence analysis directly facilitated the successful extraction of a trapped Joint Special Operations team deep behind enemy lines. Working for 72 consecutive hours under intense pressure, Captain Jenkins identified a critical vulnerability in the enemy's encrypted communications, routing our operators through a blind spot and saving the lives of 12 American soldiers." My dad was openly weeping. Grandma had both hands over her mouth. Aunt Brenda looked like she had just been struck by lightning. Mitchell snapped the velvet box open. Inside, resting on the black silk, was the Defense Meritorious Service Medal. "You don't push paper, Sarah," Colonel Mitchell said, stepping forward and handing me the box. "You win the wars the rest of the country doesn't even know we're fighting, and it's an honor to serve with you." The heavy oak door clicked shut behind Colonel Mitchell, but the echo of his footsteps seemed to linger in the dining room for an eternity. He had stayed just long enough to pin the medal to my sweater, shake my hand, and offer a crisp salute. Then, like a ghost returning to the fog, he was gone, heading back down the mountain road to Denver. I stood at the table, the weight of the heavy bronze medal resting against my chest, staring down at the velvet box in my hand. The silence in the lodge was absolute. You could hear the crackle and pop of the logs burning in the massive stone fireplace. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Finally, Uncle Robert slowly turned his head. His face had drained of all color, replacing his earlier indignation with a haunting, hollow realization. He looked at me, then down at the medal, and finally, his gaze settled on his son. "Bradley," Uncle Robert said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a razor blade. "What did he mean? When he asked about your company commander?" Bradley was glued to his chair. The swagger, the false bravado, the carefully constructed persona of the elite warrior had evaporated entirely. He looked like a frightened child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the table, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "Dad, you know how these officers are," Bradley stammered, his voice cracking. "He's an intelligence guy, a brass polisher. He doesn't know the operators on the ground. We ran black ops, off the books. They wouldn't keep records of us." "Stop it," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a cold, practiced authority that I usually reserved for briefing flag officers. Bradley flinched. "Just stop it, Brad," I continued, taking a step toward him. "Black Ops don't buy their silver stars on the internet. Operators don't pin their air assault badges crooked. And they certainly don't forget the name of the man who commanded them." "You don't know anything!" Aunt Brenda shrieked, suddenly leaping to her feet. Her hands were shaking violently as she pointed a finger at me. "This is a setup! You brought your boss here to embarrass my son because you've always been jealous of him. You couldn't handle that Bradley was the real hero, so you orchestrated this sick little theater." "Brenda, sit down," Granddad commanded. It was the first time he had spoken all evening, and the deep, rumbling timbre of his voice commanded instant obedience. Granddad was a Korean War veteran, a man who rarely spoke of his own service, but held a quiet reverence for those who did. Aunt Brenda froze, trembling, before slowly sinking back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. Granddad turned his piercing blue eyes onto Bradley. "Son, your uncle bought you that custom hunting knife before you shipped out. You told us you used it to cut a comrade out of a burning Humvee outside of Kandahar. A boy named Private First Class Thomas Reynolds. You stood in my living room, crying, telling me how you held his hand until the medevac arrived." Bradley swallowed audibly, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. I did, Granddad, I swear." I felt a sickening knot twist in my stomach. The twist of the knife wasn't just the lie, it was the specific, grotesque theft of another family's grief. "Thomas Reynolds," I repeated, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. I looked at Bradley, my eyes narrowing. "You claimed you were with Thomas Reynolds when he died?" "Yes," Bradley shouted, sounding desperate. "See? I have the details. I was there." "You were not there, Bradley," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper, because Private First Class Thomas Reynolds was a real soldier from the 10th Mountain Division. He was killed by an IED in Helmand Province in 2011. The reason I know that the reason his name is burned into my memory is because my intelligence cell analyzed the post-blast forensics to track down the bomb maker who killed him. It took us 6 months, but we found the cell responsible. I stepped right up to Bradley's chair, leaning down, so I was eye level with him. "You read an article about a fallen hero online," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You read a grieving family's tragedy, and you stole it. You stole a dead man's name to make yourself look tough at family barbecues." Uncle Robert let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He stumbled backward, knocking his chair to the floor with a loud crash. "Bradley," Uncle Robert choked out, his fists clenched at his sides. "Tell me right now, tell me the truth. Before I throw you out of this house myself, what did you actually do in the army?" Bradley broke. The facade shattered completely, and the golden boy began to weep. It wasn't a dignified cry, it was a loud, ugly, humiliating breakdown. "I washed out," Bradley sobbed, covering his face, smearing tears over his fake medals. "I washed out in advanced individual training at Fort Lee. I tore a ligament in my ankle stepping off a truck, and I failed the physical fitness tests. They chaptered me out. Entry-level separation. I was a water purification specialist, Dad. I never deployed. I never even made it to a real unit." The words hung in the air, toxic and devastating. For 7 years, Bradley had fed the family a steady diet of blockbuster action movies, casting himself as the lead. He had accepted free drinks at bars, basked in the praise of our grandparents, and belittled my actual service, all while holding a discharge paper that categorized his military career as a failure to launch. The aftermath of Bradley's confession was swift and merciless. He didn't even stay the night. Within an hour, he was packing his bags in complete, suffocating silence. Aunt Brenda trailed behind him down the hallway, sobbing and begging him to stay, desperate to salvage the shattered illusion. But Uncle Robert just sat frozen by the dying embers of the fireplace. He didn't say a single word as Bradley's truck tires crunched against the gravel, the taillights disappearing down the dark Colorado mountain road. The golden boy was gone, taking his fabricated war with him. The next morning, the lodge felt entirely different. The oppressive hierarchy that had defined the Jenkins family for decades had evaporated. I walked down to the kitchen early, dressed in faded sweatpants and an old university hoodie, craving a quiet cup of coffee and a return to my comfortable anonymity. My dad was already there, leaning against the counter. He looked exhausted, the stress of the previous night carving deep lines around his eyes. But when he looked at me, the tension melted into profound pride. He walked over, wrapping me in a fierce, crushing hug. "I always knew," my dad whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know the classified details, Sarah. I didn't know about Syria or the medals, but I knew my daughter. I knew you were doing something extraordinary." Later that afternoon, Granddad found me on the back porch overlooking the tree line. The crisp mountain wind bit at our faces. We stood in silence for a long time before he finally spoke, his deep, rumbling voice filled with regret. "I owe you an apology, Sarah," Granddad said, his breath pluming in the cold air. "You don't owe me anything," I replied quickly, but he held up a weathered hand. "I do. I let that boy spin his fairy tales because I wanted a grandson charging up the hill like the men in my day. I was blind to his lies, and in my blindness, I let this family disrespect you." He reached out, squeezing my shoulder with a firm, steady grip. "You didn't ask for the spotlight. You just did the work and kept your oath. I have never been prouder to share this family name with someone." The remainder of the weekend was a quiet adjustment. Aunt Brenda avoided me, barricading herself in her room to mourn the loss of her bragging rights. But the younger cousins looked at me with newfound awe, suddenly eager to ask about my college days and language training. When Sunday arrived, I loaded my rental car and merged onto the highway, heading back toward the shadows of my real life. I glanced at the velvet presentation box sitting on the passenger seat. For years, I had let Bradley's loud, empty lies make me feel small. But as the mountains faded in my rearview mirror, I realized true honor is found in the dark, windowless rooms and the grueling, thankless hours. I was Captain Sarah Jenkins, and I finally knew my exact worth. Sometimes the loudest people in the room have the most to hide, while the quiet ones are the ones actually keeping the world turning. I hope my story proves that real honor doesn't need an audience, and lies always crumble under the weight of the truth. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button, share this video with anyone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life dramas.